She didn't pack a suitcase because she was hurt. She packed it because she had disappeared. Carolyn Mitchell was the kind of wife every man dreams of, loyal, patient, and quietly capable. But after 43 years of marriage, she realized she'd become invisible in her own home. What made her stay? And more importantly, what made her powerful again? Carolyn Mitchell had always thought she would enjoy the quiet. After decades of running a household, raising 2 boys, and putting her own dreams on the back burner, she imagined retirement would be her time, a time for peace, for her books, her calligraphy, maybe even a little garden in the backyard. Don, her husband of 43 years, had just retired from the local public works department. They had a decent pension, a modest but cozy home in Indiana, and good health. To the outside world, they were the lucky ones. But behind the neatly trimmed hedges and the cheerful mailbox that said, "The Mitchells," Carolyn's world had grown dangerously silent, not the peaceful kind, but the suffocating kind. The kind where every sentence was a command. The kind where her thoughts had become internal monologues. The kind where she answered yes with a smile, while her soul whispered, "I'm tired." It wasn't always like this. Don wasn't abusive. He didn't hit her. He didn't scream. But somewhere along the line, he'd stopped seeing her. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. It started small. Don't forget the brand I like, not that cheap soy sauce. Pick up my prescription. You remember which one. Why is the kitchen sponge dry? That means you didn't clean the sink. At first, Carolyn brushed it off. Don was getting older, more set in his ways. She chalked it up to post-retirement restlessness. But as the days passed, it felt like her life was being slowly eaten by termites. Quiet, invisible, but devastating. She couldn't tell anyone, not her sons, not her friends. What would she say? That her husband was annoying? That he didn't say thank you anymore? That he corrected the way she folded towels? They would laugh. That's just how men are. No, this was different. Carolyn began to notice how much of her day was spent responding to someone else's voice, someone else's needs, someone else's preferences. And it wasn't just the errands or chores. It was deeper than that. It was the sense that she had disappeared. She wasn't Carolyn anymore. She was Don's wife, the supporting character, the house manager, the background music to someone else's life. But even then, she didn't say a word. Because that's what women like Carolyn were taught, to endure, to smooth things over, to make the peace. Until one afternoon, a neighbor dropped by. "Oh, did you hear about Helen down the block?" "No, what happened?" Carolyn asked, drying her hands on a dish towel. "She left her husband. After 38 years. Said she couldn't take the way he breathed down her neck every day since he retired." Carolyn laughed politely, but something twisted inside her. Helen had always seemed strong, outspoken. She left, and suddenly, Carolyn wasn't laughing anymore. That night, Don complained that the rice was too dry. Carolyn apologized softly, but inside, something cracked. She stared at the dishes in the sink, the empty chair at the head of the table, and realized, this can't be all there is. She had given up her teaching career when the boys were born. She told herself it was for the family. But now the family was grown, the boys were gone, and all she had left was a schedule filled with meals, laundry, and being corrected like a child. What was once a partnership now felt like a performance, and she was the only one on stage, trying to keep the lights on. Was she crazy to feel this way? Was she selfish? Or was she finally waking up? Carolyn didn't know the answer. Not yet. But she was about to find out. It was a Tuesday morning when Carolyn realized she no longer asked questions. She waited for instructions. She stood in the kitchen, coffee pot hissing softly, the local news murmuring in the background. Don walked in, scratching his chest, and without so much as a good morning, he said, "Call Dr. Ferguson's office. I need my checkup scheduled. Make it early. I don't want to waste the day." Carolyn wiped her hands and reached for the phone. But something about the way he said it, not "can you" or "would you mind," stuck with her. It was as if she were the secretary, the help, not his wife. She had been making his appointments for years. It wasn't new. But that day, it felt heavier. And it didn't stop there. Later that afternoon, she brought up the bank account. They'd been getting letters about their retirement investments, and she wanted to double-check the numbers. "Dawn," she began, carefully, "do you think we could go over the account together? I'd like to understand where we stand, just in case." He didn't even look up from his crossword. "There's nothing to worry about. I told you, I've got it handled." "I know, I'd feel better if I knew where the documents are." "Carolyn," he said, with that tone, firm, final, condescending, "you don't need to stress about this. I manage the money. Always have. You just focus on the house, all right?" She swallowed the lump in her throat. It was always like this now. She asked, he dismissed. She suggested, he corrected. He didn't shout. He didn't belittle. He simply erased her voice with a calm, patronizing wave. And the worst part? He didn't even know he was doing it. That night, she sat in bed beside him. Don was snoring softly, his chest rising and falling in rhythm with the fan. She stared at the ceiling, hands folded on her lap, feeling something she hadn't named in years. Small, not hurt, not angry, just diminished. Like a piece of furniture, functional, familiar, but unnoticed. She thought back to her 20s, when she had dreams of opening a small tutoring center for struggling kids. Don had supported the idea at first, but then the boys came along, and it just made more sense for her to stay home. He said it so often, it just makes more sense, that she started believing it wasn't a compromise, but a fact. Now she saw it for what it was, the first link in a long, invisible chain. The next morning, Don asked where the checkbook was. She told him. Then, without thinking, he added, "You're lucky I keep things in order. God knows what this house would look like if I left it to you." Carolyn froze. She had vacuumed every room, organized the pantry by expiration date, mailed out birthday cards to every niece and nephew, and kept the house running like clockwork for over 4 decades. But none of that mattered. Not in his eyes. To Dawn, she was the assistant, the subordinate, the woman who waited for instructions. Not a partner, not an equal. She walked into the guest bathroom, shut the door, and sat on the edge of the tub. Her reflection in the mirror stared back, tired but clear-eyed. And for the first time in a long time, she whispered out loud, "Is this what I am now?" She didn't believe Don was a bad man. He wasn't cruel, at least not intentionally. But that was part of the problem. He didn't even know he was hurting her. That night, she Googled something she never thought she would. Signs of emotional control in marriage. Article after article popped up. Terms like power imbalance, passive control, emotional neglect. It was like reading her own diary. And right there, in black and white, she read, When your role is reduced to fulfilling instructions, your identity begins to fade. Carolyn closed the laptop. Her fingers trembled. She wasn't crazy. She wasn't overreacting. She was disappearing. Friday evening, 6:04 p.m. Don's old high school buddy was coming over, last minute, as usual. Carolyn stood in the kitchen staring into the refrigerator. 3 eggs, half a tomato, a leftover chicken breast, and not a single beer in sight. "He's just stopping by for the game," Don said casually from the living room, remote already in hand. "Maybe throw together some snacks. We still got that salsa, right?" Carolyn smiled faintly and nodded, even though she knew the salsa had expired a month ago. It wasn't the snacks. It wasn't the beer. It wasn't even the mess she knew she'd be left to clean once the game was over. It was the invisible checklist that came flooding into her mind. Find clean hand towels for the guest bathroom, hide the basket of unfolded laundry, light a candle to make the house smell nice, set out coasters so Don wouldn't yell about rings on the table, and most of all, make it all look effortless. This wasn't just housework. This was emotional labor. At 6:32 p.m., the doorbell rang. Don shouted, "It's open!" Without moving an inch, Carolyn, wiping her hands on her apron, rushed to the door and opened it with a warm smile. "Gary, so good to see you. Come on in." Gary stepped in, chuckling. Still as sharp as ever. "Carolyn, you haven't aged a day." She laughed politely, accepting the compliment but not believing a word of it. She ushered him in, got the drinks, laid out the snacks, even remembered to turn the thermostat down a few degrees. Don liked it cooler when guests were over. It made him seem more in control. For the next 2 hours, Carolyn floated, not as a person, but as a presence. She laughed at the right jokes, refilled the chip bowl before it emptied, kept the dog from barking, monitored the clock to make sure the casserole didn't burn. And when the game got heated, she refilled Don's glass, even before he asked. Don never looked her in the eye. He didn't need to. She was already doing everything before he realized it needed to be done. At 9:03 p.m., Gary left, full and satisfied. "Thanks for everything, Carolyn," he said, stepping out the door. "Of course," she replied, still smiling, even as her feet throbbed and her back ached. When she returned to the living room, Don was already halfway into his recliner. "Gary really enjoyed himself," he said, grabbing the remote. "Thanks for making it smooth." That was it. No great job. No, you worked hard. Not even a simple thank you. Just, you made it smooth. Like she was a hotel staff member who'd done her shift. Carolyn went to the kitchen and started loading the dishwasher. Her mind was quiet. Too quiet. She didn't want a parade. She didn't want praise. But something. Anything. To acknowledge that she had done something that mattered. That would have been nice. She remembered reading once that women carry what's called the mental load. It's not just the cooking or the cleaning. It's the remembering, the anticipating, the managing of everyone's emotions so that no one gets upset, uncomfortable, or disappointed. And it never stops. Even when she's tired. Even when she's sick. Even when no one notices. Especially then. She sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the empty spot where her journal usually sat. She hadn't written in weeks. Didn't even know what to say anymore. Instead, she picked up a post-it note and scribbled, "If no one sees me, did I still do the work?" She stared at the note for a long time, then stuck it to the fridge. The next morning, it was gone. "Carolyn, where's the post-it about the groceries?" Don asked, not even glancing up from the paper. She wanted to laugh. Not because it was funny, but because it was so perfectly invisible. Even her quiet cry for recognition had been mistaken for a shopping list. That night, while folding laundry, she remembered something a friend once said: "You can't pour from an empty cup." And hers had been empty for a long, long time. Carolyn always loved beautiful handwriting. When she was young, she'd spend hours copying poems into notebooks, carefully shaping each letter like it was a tiny piece of art. But life had a way of sweeping those small pleasures aside: bills, diapers, field trip forms. Somewhere along the way, her cursive became rushed, her signature became sloppy, and her notebooks turned into grocery lists. But now, at 66, she finally had time again. She joined a beginner's calligraphy class at the community center on Wednesday mornings. It was simple: 6 retirees in folding chairs, sipping coffee and practicing strokes. But for Carolyn, it felt like rediscovering a piece of herself that had been packed away for decades. Every week, she got a little better. Her instructor, a soft-spoken woman named Ruth, started pulling her aside. "Carolyn, your spacing is beautiful. This G, it feels like music." Carolyn blushed every time. Praise felt strange, foreign, but something inside her stood a little taller each time. One Thursday evening, she decided to share. She had just finished a piece, the word gratitude, framed in delicate loops, with soft watercolor blossoms around the edges. It had taken her 3 days. She waited for the right moment. After dinner, while Dawn was flipping through the TV guide, she brought it over. "I made this," she said, holding it out like a peace offering. Dawn barely looked up. "Huh," he muttered. "That's fine, but you've got a whole house to take care of. Shouldn't waste your energy on doodling." Carolyn didn't move. He didn't mean to be cruel. She knew that. He didn't even realize it was cruel. To him, it was just a hobby, like crossword puzzles or rearranging the garage. But to Carolyn, it was the first thing in years that felt entirely hers. She walked back to the kitchen, quietly placed the piece in a drawer, and sat at the table. The overhead light buzzed. The refrigerator hummed. Dawn turned the volume up, and she sat there, with a dull ache in her chest, wondering, why do I need permission to feel proud of something? The next week in class, Ruth handed Carolyn a cream-colored envelope. Inside was an invitation. The community center was hosting a small art showcase. They wanted Carolyn to contribute one of her pieces. She hesitated. "I don't know," she said, fingers trembling. "I mean, I'm not good." Ruth smiled gently. "Carolyn, it's not about being perfect. It's about being seen." That night, Carolyn brought it up at dinner. "Ruth asked me to submit a piece for the center's showcase," she said, trying to sound casual. Don didn't look up from his meatloaf. "Is that going to take more time away from the house?" Carolyn blinked. "It's just one piece. They already picked it." He shrugged. "If that's what you want to do, just make sure the yard's mowed before Saturday. Gary's coming by?" That was it. No congratulations. No, I'm proud of you. Just a reminder to keep doing what really mattered, to him. Carolyn didn't sleep much that night. Not because she was sad, but because she was angry. Not loud, dramatic anger, but the quiet kind, the kind that comes from years of being overlooked, dismissed, shrunk. She wasn't asking Don to love calligraphy. She wasn't even asking him to come to the showcase. She just wanted him to acknowledge that she had done something, that she was still growing, still becoming. The day of the showcase, Carolyn wore a soft green blouse and a necklace her sister gave her years ago. Her piece, Gratitude, now mounted on black canvas, sat proudly on an easel in the corner. Strangers came by and smiled. One woman even asked if Carolyn sold her work. She laughed. No, I'm just starting. But for the first time in a long time, she felt alive. She didn't tell Dawn about the compliments. She didn't bring home a flyer. She didn't need to. Because in that small room, with warm lights and kind eyes, she remembered something powerful. Her joy didn't need approval to be real. It started with the news. A segment on the local station featured a story about a 58-year-old woman opening her own auto repair shop, the first female-owned one in the county. Carolyn smiled. Good for her, she murmured, rinsing out her teacup. Dawn, across the room, scoffed. What's next? Women fighting fires in high heels? Carolyn turned. She runs a business. Dawn, it's not about heels. It's about doing what she loves. Dawn shook his head, muttering, that's not how things were meant to be. It wasn't the first time. Dawn had always held on to the belief that men provided and women preserved. He'd grown up in a home where his mother made 3 hot meals a day, ironed his father's shirts, and never once questioned who paid the bills. To Dawn, that was order. That was how things worked. Carolyn, for years, had gone along with it. She didn't agree, not always, but she understood him. She excused it. But lately, his comments hit differently. Not like quirks of an aging man. They sounded like chains. A few days later, over lunch, Carolyn mentioned their niece Emily had just gotten a promotion at her law firm, senior partner at only 35. Dawn didn't even blink. Well, good for her. Let's see how long that lasts once she starts having kids. Can't raise babies from a corner office. Carolyn froze. The words were sharp, not in tone, but in implication. She placed her fork down. You know, Dawn, I could have gone back to teaching after the boys grew up. Dawn looked up, surprised. What for? We were fine. The boys needed you at home. I was providing. But I needed something too, she said quietly. And no one ever asked? He stared at her. Well, that's how we made it this far. You think those boys turned out great by accident? We did things right. People today, all this nonsense about finding yourself, they don't know what sacrifice means. Carolyn smiled, but not the warm kind. It was the smile you give when you're done arguing with a wall. That's the thing. Dawn, I did sacrifice. A lot. But now that I want something back, you make me feel like I'm asking for too much. Later that evening, Carolyn sat alone on the back porch. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the lawn. Dawn insisted on mowing twice a week. She looked around, the rose bushes she planted, the bird feeder she refilled every morning, the wind chime that never stopped singing. She had built this life with him, but she had never been allowed to renovate it. The next morning, over breakfast, she tried again. You know, she said softly, when I was younger, I wanted to get a master's degree. In education. I even applied once. Never told you. Don sipped his coffee. You didn't need all that. You were already a great mother. I could have been both, she said. He didn't respond. That silence, that unbearable, dismissive silence, was louder than any shout. In therapy books, they call it value dissonance, when two people in a relationship no longer share the same understanding of what life should look like. Carolyn didn't know the term, but she felt it in her bones. Don wasn't trying to hurt her. He was just stuck, frozen in time. And his inability to evolve had become a prison, not just for him, but for her. That evening, their granddaughter came over for dinner. At 17, Lily was fiery and curious. She talked about her dream to study aerospace engineering. Carolyn beamed. Dawn raised an eyebrow. Space? Maybe start with nursing or teaching. Something more practical. Lily frowned. Carolyn squeezed her hand under the table. And at that moment, Carolyn saw it clearly. Dawn's world was shrinking. Hers was trying to expand. She had a choice to make. Not to leave, not to fight, but to stop letting his limits define her boundaries. It was a Tuesday. Cloudy. Not cold, but not warm either. One of those in-between days, the kind that made everything feel suspended, like the world was holding its breath. Carolyn had just finished cleaning the bathroom, again. Not because it was dirty, but because Dawn had offhandedly said, "Smelled a bit musty in there yesterday. Maybe open a window or use that lemon spray." That wasn't a request. It was code for fix it. She stood in the hallway, still holding the sponge in her gloved hand, and stared at the closed bedroom door. Something inside her snapped, not loud, not dramatic. It was more like a thread that finally gave way after too much quiet strain. She walked to the bedroom, pulled out a small duffel bag from under the bed, and started packing. 2 pairs of pants, 3 tops, her vitamins, the framed calligraphy piece that said, "Still becoming." She placed it gently between her clothes like it might break. Then she stood there, not moving, not breathing, listening for something, a voice, a reason, a sound. But all she heard was the tick of the wall clock and Don's soft hum from the living room, flipping through channels. He didn't know she was packing. And worse, she realized he wouldn't notice she was gone until dinner time. She sat on the edge of the bed, bag half zipped, and looked around the room. There was the dresser she'd picked out 20 years ago, the curtains she sewed herself, the photo of their boys as toddlers, framed beside Don's old bowling trophy. This was her life. This room, this house, this history. She wasn't running from abuse. She wasn't bruised. She was just erased. And that, somehow, felt harder to explain. Where would she go? She had a friend across town, Maria, who had a guest room. But Carolyn couldn't imagine showing up at the door with a duffel bag and a quiet ache in her chest. What would she say? "My husband doesn't see me anymore. He thanks the grocery clerk more than he thanks me." Would Maria nod, pour wine, and say same here? Or worse, would she say, "You're lucky. At least he comes home." That thought hit Carolyn hard. Was this luck? Was being invisible better than being alone? She opened her closet and pulled out a scarf, the one Don hated. "Makes you look old," he once said. But she liked it. It was warm, and hers. She wrapped it around her shoulders and sat back down. Not crying, just thinking. Then she heard it. Not shouting, not chaos, just Don's voice from the living room. "Carolyn, did we ever get more coffee filters? I can't find them." It was so normal, so casual, so oblivious that she laughed. Out loud, for the first time in weeks. A bitter, breathy kind of laugh that made her eyes sting. She didn't answer. She didn't move. She just sat there and asked herself the most terrifying question she'd ever let fully form. What if I stay, but I stop shrinking? What if she didn't leave the house, but left the role? What if she stayed, but changed the rules? What if she took up space again? She didn't unpack right away. But she didn't leave, either. That night, Dawn came to bed and grunted something about the thermostat. She didn't reply. She just turned over and stared at the window, feeling her breath steady for the first time all day. In the darkness, she whispered to herself, "I don't need to run. I need to reclaim." It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a manifesto. It was a beginning. And that made all the difference. The turning point didn't come with a fight. No slammed doors. No packed bags. No screaming matches in the driveway. It came on a Saturday morning, over a cup of tea, and 5 quiet words. "He's the weather, not me." Carolyn was sitting in a folding chair at the community center's mindfulness workshop. She had seen the flyer on the library bulletin board weeks ago, "Inner Calm After 60, Reclaiming Your Center," and signed up without telling Don. She didn't need his approval anymore. Not for this. The room smelled faintly of lavender and old carpet. A dozen women sat in a loose circle, sipping tea and listening to the speaker, a retired therapist named June. June talked about expectations, about the emotional toll of caregiving, about how women, especially in long-term marriages, often confuse loyalty with silence. Then she said, "Some people in your life are like the weather. You can't change whether it rains or shines, but you can choose whether you walk in the storm or carry an umbrella." Carolyn felt her throat tighten. That's it, she thought. That's exactly it. Don was the weather. Predictable in his unpredictability. Sunny some mornings, stormy by dinner, cold without warning, hot over nothing. And all this time, she had been adjusting her mood, her day, her entire being to fit his forecast. If he was quiet, she tiptoed. If he was annoyed, she cooked his favorite meal. If he was short-tempered, she blamed herself. But now, something shifted. She didn't need to change him. She needed to stop letting him decide her climate. That night, back home, the dishwasher beeped. Carolyn turned it off and began wiping the counters. Don walked in, holding an empty glass. "No more orange juice?" She didn't flinch, didn't apologize, didn't scramble to offer an alternative. She looked up, calmly. "No, we're out. I'll grab some tomorrow." He blinked, caught off guard by her even tone. Then, the old Don surfaced, the one who needed to assert control. "You know I like it in the mornings. Maybe think ahead next time." Carolyn felt her chest tighten. Just for a second. The old reflex, the urge to defend, to soothe, rose. But she took a deep breath. And in her mind, she whispered, "He's the weather." Then she smiled softly. Noted. And walked away. The next day, she practiced something June had taught them. Observer mode. Every time Don said something critical or dismissive, she silently narrated it like a documentary voiceover. Here we see the retired male, asserting dominance over the laundry schedule. Fascinating behavior from a creature who hasn't folded a towel in 20 years. It was silly. But it worked. She stopped reacting, stopped absorbing, started noticing without carrying. She also began reframing her own actions. When she made dinner, it wasn't because he expected it, it was because she chose to nourish. When she watered the plants, it wasn't because she had nothing better to do. It was because she loved watching things grow. She wasn't performing. She was aligning with her own values. Each task, each word, each silence became a choice, not a resignation. One morning, Don criticized her for leaving the porch light on. "Electricity isn't free," he muttered. Carolyn smiled. "Neither is peace of mind," she replied. Don paused, caught mid-coffee sip. She didn't elaborate. She didn't escalate. She simply went back to reading her book, The Gifts of Imperfection by Brené Brown, and underlined the phrase, "Daring to set boundaries is about having the courage to love ourselves, even when we risk disappointing others." That week, Carolyn began a new habit. Every night before bed, she wrote down 3 things. One thing she did for herself, one moment she didn't react, one thing she was grateful for, even if it was small. Some nights, the list felt forced. Other nights, it saved her. Don didn't change overnight. He still grumbled, still made snide remarks about woo-woo classes and women with too much free time. But slowly, very slowly, he started to notice something was different. Carolyn wasn't angry. She wasn't distant. She was simply centered, unshaken, undeniably calm. And that, somehow, unsettled him more than any argument ever had. Because for the first time in decades, Dawn wasn't the one who set the temperature in the house. Carolyn was holding the thermostat now, and she liked it set to peace. It started with socks. Dawn couldn't find them. "Carolyn," he called from the bedroom, "where are my brown socks? The ones I wear with the loafers." She was in the kitchen, sipping her tea. She heard him, clearly. But she waited a moment, finished her sip, and walked in calmly. "They're in the drawer. Second row. Where they always are." He grunted. "Didn't look like it." She smiled. "Then maybe check again." No snark, no apology, no rushing to grab them herself. Just a calm, unmoved presence. Dawn stood there, silent for a beat. Then turned, opened the drawer, and found them, exactly where she said they were. He didn't say thank you, but he didn't snap either. And that was new. The shift was subtle at first. Carolyn didn't raise her voice. She didn't slam doors. She didn't teach him a lesson. She simply refused to be rattled. She set the table if she wanted to. She went for walks by herself when she needed to. She started saying, "I'm busy," without guilt, even if busy just meant resting. Don noticed. At first, he grew agitated. Her peace felt like defiance. But as the days passed, her consistency did something unexpected. It disarmed him. Because it wasn't rebellion. It was clarity. One afternoon, he came in from mowing the lawn and saw her at the table, sketching calligraphy. He paused. "You working on another one of those quote things?" She nodded. He hovered, awkward. "What's this one say?" She turned the paper around. In soft, elegant loops, it read, "I choose stillness, not silence." He stared at it longer than she expected. Then, almost inaudibly, he said, "That's actually nice." Carolyn didn't reply. She didn't need to. A few days later, Don came back from the store with groceries. He usually only picked up what he liked, his cereal, his coffee, his snacks. But this time, tucked between the bananas and butter, was a small bottle of lavender dish soap. The kind Carolyn liked. She hadn't asked for it. She hadn't even mentioned it. She just noticed it was there. She placed it by the sink and smiled. Not because it was grand, but because it meant he noticed her. That evening, after dinner, Don stood awkwardly in the kitchen. "You want me to help with the dishes?" Carolyn turned, drying her hands. He'd never asked that before. She nodded slowly. "Sure, you can dry." He nodded like a man learning to walk again. It was clumsy, but it was real. That night in bed, Don stared at the ceiling. After a long silence, he said, "You've been different lately. Carolyn waited. Not in a bad way, he added quickly. Just calm, not like before. She looked at him. Before I reacted to everything? He chuckled, sheepish. Yeah, I guess. She nodded. I'm learning how to protect my peace. He was quiet. Then, to her surprise, he whispered, I think I miss you. The old you, the you who laughed more. Carolyn's eyes stung. I'm still here, she said gently. I just stopped shrinking. The next morning, Don made coffee. Black, the way he liked it. But he also left a cup for her on the counter, with oat milk, the way she liked it. She didn't say anything, but her heart softened. Not because it was perfect, but because it was a beginning. Psychologists call it systemic response. When one part of a system changes, the rest must adapt or fall out of sync. Carolyn hadn't forced Don to change. She had changed herself, and the ripple effect was undeniable. Later that week, they sat on the porch together. Don cleared his throat. You've been strong lately. Like, really strong? Carolyn glanced at him, surprised. He continued, I don't think I ever realized how much I depended on you to make the house work. Or how little I said it. She didn't speak, just listened. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and said, Thank you. 2 words. Small. Simple. But they landed like thunder. Because when a storm passes, and the sun breaks through, you don't need fireworks. You just need stillness. And someone who finally sees the sky. It wasn't about Don. It never really had been. Carolyn realized that one quiet morning as she stood by the kitchen window, cradling a warm mug of tea and watching the sunrise spill across the lawn like honey. Don was still asleep. The house was still. But inside her, for the first time in years, there was no noise. No rehearsed comebacks. No mental checklists. No waiting for the next jab, the next correction, the next invisible cut. Just peace. Not the peace of everything being perfect. The peace of no longer needing it to be. Carolyn didn't leave. She didn't burn bridges or write dramatic farewell letters. Instead, she stayed. But not as Don's wife. Not as the silent manager of his moods. She stayed as herself, fully, calmly, unapologetically. She reclaimed her routines, reimagined her boundaries, rebuilt her sense of worth, brick by quiet brick. The changes in Don were slow. There were still moments, careless comments, old habits trying to creep back in. But he caught himself more often now, because Carolyn no longer absorbed his weather. And that, more than anything, taught him how much of her he had taken for granted. He began asking questions. How was your class? Did you finish that new piece? Want me to come to the next showcase? He even came once. Sat in the back of the community center, surrounded by folding chairs and watercolor quotes, watching her smile as people praised her work. When they got home, he said, that gratitude piece. I liked it. She didn't ask why. She didn't need to. They still had dinner together. Still argued, sometimes. Still disagreed on what to watch at night. But the energy had shifted. Carolyn no longer felt like she was tiptoeing around a sleeping dragon. She walked with her own rhythm. And Dawn, slowly, began to match her pace, not out of pressure, but out of respect. One afternoon, she found an envelope on her pillow. Inside was a note, written in Dawn's stiff, uneven handwriting. Thank you for staying when you had every right to go. She sat on the bed and read it twice. Not because she doubted it, but because she wanted to remember the weight of those words. They weren't flowers. They weren't an apology for everything, but they were real, and they were his. Carolyn kept writing. She framed more pieces, gave some as gifts. Don even helped her build a shelf for them in the hallway. Your gallery, he called it. She laughed. It's just handwriting. He looked at her, serious. No, it's you. And she realized that was the gift. Not that Don had changed. Not that he said thank you. But that she had shown up for herself, even when no one else did. She had stopped waiting. Stopped shrinking. Stopped trading silence for security. The weather still came, moody mornings, small tempests, passive sighs. But Carolyn had her umbrella, her stillness, her strength, and she no longer mistook his thunder for her fault. Years later, when her granddaughter Lily interviewed her for a school project on women who inspire, Carolyn smiled. What do you want to know? Lily grinned. Everything. But mostly, how did you become so strong? Carolyn looked out the window, where Don was planting tomatoes in the backyard. He waved. She waved back. Then she turned to Lily and said, I stopped needing anyone to hand me the sun. I learned how to light my own fire. You don't need a different partner to find peace. You need a deeper understanding of your own power. And once you reclaim it, quietly, steadily, fully, the world around you will shift. Not because it has to, but because you already did. There's a kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone. It comes from sitting across the dinner table from someone who used to see you, and now only sees what's missing from the fridge. Carolyn's story isn't rare. Many women wake up one day and realize they've traded their identity for a role: the peacemaker, the scheduler, the unthanked provider. Over time, that trade becomes a habit. And that habit becomes a silence so loud, it drowns out who they used to be. But here's the truth. Peace isn't given, it's claimed. Carolyn didn't wait for her husband to wake up. She woke up herself. She stopped shrinking to fit his expectations. She stopped earning love through obedience. And by reclaiming her own rhythm, she shifted the entire marriage without raising her voice once. This story isn't about blaming. It's about recognizing the quiet power in choosing yourself, not in rage, not in rebellion, but in clarity. You don't need to leave to begin again. Sometimes, you just need to stop disappearing. Have you ever felt like your voice got quieter in your own home? Like the more you gave, the less you were seen? Tell us in the comments. What would your first act of reclaiming look like? A solo walk? A new class? Saying no without guilt? Let's support each other. You never know who might read your story and find the courage to change their own. If Carolyn's journey moved you, don't keep it to yourself. Like, comment, and subscribe. Share this video with a friend who might need this reminder. Your worth was never meant to be negotiable.